Day. I call on Government Order of the Day number 1.
Interrupted debate on the second reading of the Social Housing Reform Transaction Mandate Bill.
The question is that the...
Sorry, does Colonel Sitlani not taking her call?
Well, I think if the member casts his eyes around, he could probably work that out.
To that point,
well, there is no point of order.
Point of order. Point of order.
I've already ruled that the question that's been raised by the senior government whip is not a point of order.
Point of order.
Point of order, Ian Lees-Galloway.
Just to assist with the order of the House, usually the Speaker does ask if the member who was on their feet wishes to complete their call, and that would be a signal to other members who are intending to take a call that it might be time for them to rise to their feet and take theirs.
Well, I think the member for his assistance to the House in that particular area, but I also think it was unnecessary in that if members had been alert, they would have already taken the call. The question is, Dennis O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government is trying to get the state out of social housing in this country. They want to fob it off to often ill-equipped non-profit organisations, and they are selling houses at the very time when more houses need to be built and when the state needs to be involved in that. The government should be building more houses. They should be upgrading and improving existing state houses. Their concentration is simply for ideological purposes on the sale of state houses, and that's wrong. This particular bill empowers ministers to direct the sale of houses which are in the ownership of the Housing Corporation of New Zealand. And the reason for that is, of course, that the government actually doesn't trust the corporation and wants to do the job itself. And they want to do it ostensibly for what it calls housing reform objectives. But in fact, the objective is really just ideological, the privatisation of social housing. And the real objective of this particular bill is simply to fast-track that process by giving the two ministers excessive executive powers. Mr. Speaker, the government in its own disclosure statement was correct when it said, and I quote, "The transaction mandate is an unusual mechanism. It provides ministers with the ability to effect the transfer of HNZC assets in HNZC's name without a decision-making role for the HNZC board," unquote. So as I said, clearly the government doesn't trust the board to do its job, and the government wants to do it for it. In that respect, the government wants to both pay the piper and to call the tune. So it's yet another example of this government's habit of extending executive powers. And Mr. Speaker, I've complained many times in this House that this government is taking on more and more powers to the executive in many of the bills it brings before the House, thus sidelining Parliament, and in this case, effectively sidelining one of the government's most important agencies, the Housing New Zealand Corporation. And that's wrong, and that sort of thing really does need to stop. Now, another issue, Mr. Speaker, is this. The bill allows the land acquired by Housing New Zealand under the Public Works Act to be transferred without complying with the usual offer-back process. And I think I know why that is particularly the case, because when Nick Smith was embarrassed a year or so ago over the government land which was not in fact available in Auckland for housing, as he claimed was available, he then made reckless statements about how much land the government had available and whether in fact it was suitable for housing or not, and got into deep trouble about all of that because he simply didn't check first whether the land was actually available for housing or not, and if so, how much. So this bill's really a safe-saving device for Nick Smith, and it allows the Public Works Act to be bypassed, and what the government is effectively doing is saying to hell with people who had rights under that Act, under the offer-back provisions, because we want to get on with this quickly and we want to save Nick Smith's neck. Mr. Speaker, there are at least 2,000 houses up for sale by this process. So I ask this simple question: who gets the proceeds of them and what are they going to be used for? I haven't yet heard any government member answer that question. I asked it in the first reading speech. I ask it again now. I see that new section 2A7 inserted by clause 4 says that the proceeds, quote, must be paid to a Crown bank account, unquote. And that is all it says. And that's not answering my question. So what is the mandate for that money? Will it go to new social housing? How many new houses will be built? How many houses will be upgraded or replaced? Mr. Speaker, as I've said, fundamentally the government wants to get the state out of the provision of social housing, and the result will be to deepen the housing crisis. And as a result, no new houses will be built, because it doesn't matter whose ownership they are in. What does matter is how many of them there are, and this bill does nothing to assist that problem. And the rationale of the bill is ostensibly the objectives set out in new section 50D, which actually gives no cause for hope whatsoever in terms of more and better state housing. Now, amongst the objectives listed are one which says, and this is C, quote, social housing tenants are helped to independence as appropriate, unquote. What does that mean? Well, to me, it's pretty obvious. It means pushing people out of state houses, people who have been assessed for some reason as being capable of renting in the private market, so they'll be pushed out of state houses. That's what that means. And another one in D says, quote, there is more diverse ownership or provision of social housing, unquote. What does that mean? What that means simply is privatisation of state houses for ideological purposes. And another one in F, quote, the supply of affordable housing is increased, especially in Auckland, unquote. Well, how on earth is that going to happen? Because all this bill is going to do is to transfer ownership from the state to other providers. So how's that going to increase the number of houses? How's that going to improve the quality of houses? How's that going to really help solve the housing crisis? A crisis which this government, by its gross inaction, has actually caused. This government is doing nothing to solve that problem. And in the end, this bill is just another nail in the coffin of state housing in New Zealand. The bill will, if anything, reduce and not increase the supply of more state housing in this country. The sale money won't go to the improvement of social housing, nor will it go into more social housing for those New Zealanders who need it. Now, Mr. Speaker, concerning the reporting requirements of this bill under the Housing Act, the committee's main recommendation appears to be to insert a new subsection 28 capital A8 into clause 4. And they say it would not be appropriate for Housing New Zealand to provide such reports because it would no longer have control of the land, and instead it should be reported under the responsible ministry's annual report. Well, Mr. Speaker, how does that really help to inform the public about what's going on here, buried in some departmental report which nobody, next to nobody, ever reads? The public of this country are having this hidden from their view effectively, and this is not really reporting at all. It's just the opposite. And in fact, the majority of the committee is just doing nothing more than towing the government line. And finally, Mr. Speaker, the opposition parties, I see, are united in their opposition to the bill, and there are two main reasons for that. The first is that the bill enables the sale of a large proportion of the country's state housing stock. And while the housing crisis demands a substantial increase in the number of houses for people on low incomes and demands the improvement of those houses, simply changing the ownership of those houses addresses that problem not at all. And the second objection to the bill is very simple. It confers on the ministers, as I've said, extraordinary powers that they shouldn't have. So, Mr Speaker, for all of those reasons, New Zealand First will definitely not be supporting this bill and hasn't done so and will not do so in the future. The government needs to rethink it and not pass it as it is.